The shuttle hummed as it descended through the thick, scorching atmosphere of a car. Lieutenant George Watkins sat strapped into his seat, surrounded by a group of alien cadets who, despite their elite training, already showed signs of unease. The heat penetrated the shuttle's reinforced hull, causing beads of sweat to form on his forehead. He glanced around at his fellow participants, observing their various reactions to the inhospitable conditions they were about to face. Some adjusted their suits, designed to regulate body temperature, while others muttered calculations about how long they could last before dehydration set in. None of them seemed particularly confident. The lead instructor's voice crackled through the shuttle's intercom. "Survival test commencing. You have 72 hours. Use local resources, no external aid. If you fail to endure, you fail the program. Good luck." With a jolt, the ship landed on the surface, sending up a cloud of shimmering sand. The exit ramp lowered, releasing an oppressive wave of heat into the cabin. One by one, the cadets stepped outside. George followed, feeling the intense burn of the sun on his skin immediately. The sky was a dull burnt orange, and the air was thick with the scent of minerals and scorched dust. The sand beneath his boots was almost molten, radiating heat that made every step feel like walking on burning coals. He took a deep breath, the dry air clawing at his throat like a predator. Around him, the cadets fumbled with their equipment, scanning the area with their advanced visors, searching for any signs of shade or water. He, however, didn't bother with the gadgets. He trusted his instincts. The landscape was endless dunes and jagged rock formations, not a single source of relief in sight. This wasn't just a desert. It was a furnace designed to break them. One of the aliens, a tall, reptilian being with gleaming black scales, grumbled in frustration. "This environment is lethal. There is no viable shelter." His voice was dry, raspy, already affected by the heat. Another cadet, a blue-skinned humanoid with large reflective eyes, scanned the horizon and pointed towards a cluster of rocks in the distance. "That might provide some shade," she said. George adjusted the straps on his pack and started walking, not waiting for a consensus. If the others followed, fine. If not, they'd learn soon enough. He could hear their footsteps crunching in the sand behind him, a sign that at least some of them understood the importance of immediate action. The trek was brutal. Each step felt heavier than the last, the heat draining their energy with every passing second. The sun loomed above them like a merciless god, showing no signs of relenting. Sweat dripped down his back, but he ignored it. Hydration was key, and he wasn't going to waste moisture by panicking. After nearly half an hour, they reached the rock formation. The shade it provided was minimal, but it was better than nothing. Some cadets collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Their bodies weren't designed for these conditions. Even with their advanced biology, the relentless sun and lack of humidity were pushing them toward their limits. George sat down on a flat rock, observing their reactions. The reptilian cadet, despite his thick scales, was panting heavily, his body struggling to retain moisture. The blue-skinned humanoid wiped a thin layer of sweat from her brow, her reflective eyes squinting against the glare. Another cadet, a stocky, fur-covered alien, groaned and started digging into the sand in desperation, trying to reach cooler layers beneath. "This is unsustainable," the reptilian said. "We need water. Immediately." "No kidding," George muttered. He pulled out his canteen and took the smallest sip possible before sealing it tightly. The others did the same, but their rations wouldn't last long. He could already tell that some were drinking more than they should, hoping for immediate relief. It wouldn't last. "Technology," the blue-skinned cadet said, holding up a small scanning device. "We can search for underground reservoirs." George shook his head. "By the time you find something, you'll be too weak to dig." She frowned. "Do you have a better suggestion?" He looked around, taking in every detail of the landscape. The rocks, the way the sand shifted, the heat waves distorting the air, everything told a story. The answer wasn't in some scanner. It was right in front of them. "We need to work with what's already here," he said. He stood up and ran his hand along the rock's surface, noting its texture. It was smooth in some places, rough in others. That meant erosion, that meant moisture. even if it wasn't visible. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the rocks formed natural ridges. "There," he said, pointing. "Those formations trap cool air at night. If there's moisture anywhere, it'll collect there when the temperature drops." The others stared at him, skeptical. The blue-skinned cadet crossed her arms. "You're guessing. I'm using logic," he corrected. "I've been in places like this before. On Earth, there are deserts where water exists, just not on the surface. If we find the right spot, we can harvest enough to last." Some of the cadets exchanged doubtful glances, but given their situation, they had little choice. One by one, they stood, preparing for another trek under the sun. George smirked slightly. "Welcome to survival," he muttered under his breath before leading them toward their only hope. The alien cadets followed George across the unforgiving landscape, their exhaustion evident in the way their steps dragged through the burning sand. The sun loomed high above them, a merciless overseer that drained the strength from their bodies with every passing second. Even the reptilian cadet, who had boasted about his species' resilience to extreme conditions, was slowing down, his scales dulling as dehydration set in. The blue-skinned cadet wiped a trembling hand across her brow, her skin shimmering with sweat that evaporated almost instantly. The others fared no better, their movements sluggish, their breathing labored. George kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon with unwavering focus. He had seen this kind of exhaustion before. On Earth, in deserts where only the prepared survived. If they stopped now, it would be over for them. He adjusted the straps of his pack and pressed on, ignoring the way the heat clawed at his skin like a living thing. The cadets had no choice but to follow. As they crested a small dune, the rock formations ahead came into sharper focus. The jagged spires jutted out of the sand like the skeletal remains of some ancient creature, their surfaces pitted and scarred by the relentless winds. But George wasn't looking at the rocks themselves. He was watching the way the sand shifted at their bases, the way certain crevices remained darker than others despite the scorching sun. There was moisture here, it was just hidden beneath the surface. Without a word, he dropped to one knee and pressed his hand against the sand. It was still hot, but slightly cooler than the surrounding dunes. That was a good sign. He pulled out his knife and drove it into the ground, twisting it slightly. The sand crumbled away, revealing a layer of compacted earth beneath it. The cadets gathered around him, watching with cautious curiosity. "What are you doing?" the blue-skinned cadet asked, her voice hoarse from dehydration. George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he drove his knife in again, deeper this time, and when he pulled it back, there was a slight sheen on the blade. Moisture. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm his theory. He stood and dusted off his hands. "This spot collects condensation at night," he said. "It's not water you can drink yet, but it's a start." The reptilian cadet narrowed his eyes. "A start. We need water now." George exhaled sharply and dropped his pack onto the sand. "You don't get to be picky," he muttered, pulling out a length of reflective fabric. He began assembling a simple but effective solar still, using the rock formations to create a natural funnel where moisture would condense overnight. It wouldn't provide instant relief, but by morning they would have something. The cadets watched in silence as he worked, some too exhausted to argue, others too desperate to question his methods. The blue-skinned cadet finally crouched beside him, watching as he secured the still in place. "This will take too long," she said, her voice laced with doubt. George glanced up at her. "Do you have a better idea?" She didn't answer. Satisfied with his setup, he stood and scanned the area. They needed more than just a slow trickle of water. They needed immediate hydration, something to sustain them until the still could provide. His eyes fell on a cluster of large, hollow plants clinging to the rock face. He had seen similar plants in other arid environments. If they stored water, it wouldn't be much, but it might be enough. He strode toward the nearest one and pulled out his knife. With a quick, practiced motion, he sliced into the thick, fibrous exterior. A small trickle of liquid seeped from the cut, thick and slightly cloudy but unmistakably water. He caught a few drops on his fingertip and tasted it. Bitter, but not toxic. Behind him, the blue-skinned cadet let out a breath of relief. That's water. George nodded and stepped aside, letting the others gather around. They worked quickly, slicing into the plants and draining every last drop they could find. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the temperature dropped slightly, but the exhaustion among the group remained. The cadets slumped against the rocks, their bodies weak, their minds clouded with fatigue. George sat apart from them, his eyes fixed on the distant dunes, calculating their next move. They had survived another day, but the real test was only just beginning. As the last traces of sunlight faded beyond the horizon, the temperature on Vakar plummeted. The once scorching sand beneath George's boots cooled rapidly, and the air turned crisp, carrying an almost biting chill. The alien cadets, who had spent the entire day fighting against the brutal heat, now found themselves shivering under the darkening sky. Their bodies, weakened by dehydration and exhaustion, struggled to adjust to the sudden shift. Some huddled closer to the rock formations, seeking shelter from the winds that had begun to stir across the dunes. George crouched near the solar still, running a hand over the taut fabric he had secured earlier. The cooling temperature was working in his favor. Moisture was already beginning to condense along the surface. It wasn't much, but by morning it would be enough to sustain them for another day. He could feel the stares of the cadets on his back as he worked. Most had been too stubborn to acknowledge his efforts before, but now, in the quiet of the night, desperation had softened their resistance. The blue-skinned cadet stepped forward cautiously, her breath visible in the cold air. She hesitated before speaking. "How long until we have enough?" George didn't look up. "By dawn we should have something. It won't be a lot, but it's better than nothing." She exhaled through her nose, arms wrapped around herself to keep warm. "And after that?" He straightened, dusting off his hands. "We move." The reptilian cadet, who had been crouched nearby with his arms draped over his knees, lifted his head at George's words. His black eyes reflected the dim light of the planet's twin moons. "Move where?" George turned toward the horizon, where the dunes stretched endlessly in every direction. "Somewhere better than here. We can't stay in one spot too long. Resources will run out, and we need a more stable source of water." A few cadets exchanged uncertain glances. They had barely survived the first day. The thought of pushing forward into the unknown unsettled them. George pulled a small bundle from his pack and unwrapped it, revealing a few strips of dried rations. He tore one in half and placed it in his mouth, chewing slowly. The others watched, their hunger evident in the way their gazes lingered on the food. He considered handing out the rest, but decided against it. Rations needed to be conserved. Instead, he focused on the immediate problem: shelter. With the temperature dropping rapidly, the risk of hypothermia was just as dangerous as dehydration had been during the day. The rock formations provided some protection from the wind, but it wouldn't be enough. He needed to insulate their bodies, trap whatever heat they could produce. He glanced at the reptilian cadet, whose scales had lost their sheen. "You're cold." The cadet bared his teeth slightly. "My species is adapted to heat, not this." George nodded. He had expected as much. "Your best bet is to bury yourself in the sand. The deeper layers will hold residual warmth from the day." The reptilian's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Pride was a problem among the cadets, but pride wouldn't keep them alive. George turned to the blue-skinned cadet. "Your kind? How do you handle cold?" She flexed her fingers, her movements stiff. "We don't." "Then start digging," George said. She hesitated only briefly before following his instruction. Using her hands, she began to carve out a shallow trench in the sand, just deep enough to shield her body from the wind. Some of the other cadets followed suit, too tired to argue. George did the same, scooping out a hollow just big enough to lie in. As he settled inside, he pulled his scarf over his face, shielding himself from the biting air. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The sand, though cool on the surface, retained enough heat below to provide some relief. The night stretched on, filled with the sound of shifting winds and the occasional murmur of restless cadets. George didn't sleep. He never slept deeply in places like this. His mind remained alert, listening for any signs of movement beyond their temporary camp. At some point, the blue-skinned cadet stirred beside him. "You're still awake." He didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Always." She shifted slightly in the sand. "Why did you join this program?" George kept his eyes on the horizon. "To survive." She frowned. "That's not an answer." He sighed through his nose, adjusting his position. "I joined because I don't trust systems that assume survival is about strength or intelligence alone. It's about instinct, adaptation. I wanted to prove that." She was silent for a moment. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, "You've proven it." George didn't respond. He just listened to the wind, waiting for dawn. As the first light of dawn crept over the dunes, the temperature on Vokar began its rapid ascent. The frigid night gave way to the relentless heat in mere minutes, forcing the cadets to stir from their makeshift shelters. George sat up, shaking the loose sand from his clothes, and stretched his aching muscles. He had barely slept, but that was nothing new. His body had long since adapted to exhaustion as a constant companion. The blue-skinned cadet beside him rubbed the sand from her face, blinking against the harsh morning glare. Her skin, which had paled slightly from the cold, regained its deep azure hue as warmth returned. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, glancing around at the others. Some were slower to rise, their bodies sluggish from dehydration and exposure. The reptilian cadet emerged from the sand, his movements stiff. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. George stood and walked toward the solar still. He crouched beside it, checking the thin film of condensation that had formed overnight. With careful precision, he lifted the collection sheet, letting the precious droplets trickle into a small container. It wasn't much, but it was enough to wet his throat and keep his mind sharp. He took a measured sip, then passed the container to the blue-skinned cadet. She hesitated before drinking, her throat working as she swallowed the water in careful increments. When she finished, she handed it off to the reptilian cadet, who took it with a grudging nod. One by one, the others drank, each portion barely enough to satisfy their thirst, but enough to keep them moving. George wiped a hand across his mouth and looked toward the horizon. They couldn't stay here. The still would continue to produce water, but not fast enough. They needed a real source, something more sustainable. He had seen the way the landscape shifted under the night's cold, how certain ridges trapped moisture better than others. There had to be an underground reservoir somewhere. He adjusted the straps of his pack and turned to face the group. "We move now." The blue-skinned cadet wiped the sweat from her forehead. "Do you even know where we're going?" George pointed toward the rock formations further in the distance. "If there's water anywhere, it'll be there." The reptilian cadet narrowed his black eyes. "Or it could be just more sand." George's patience was running thin. He stepped closer, his voice even but firm. "You want to stay here? Fine, but you won't last another day on what little water we've got. The longer we wait, the harder this gets." The reptilian's gaze lingered on George's face, his jaw tight, but he didn't argue further. Slowly he turned and began adjusting his gear, preparing to move. The others followed suit. Even if they didn't trust George completely, they understood the alternative. The sun was already beginning its climb as they set out, the temperature rising with each passing step. The sand, once cool from the night, quickly turned into a burning expanse. Each footfall sent up small clouds of dust that clung to their skin, coating their clothes in a fine layer of grit. George kept his pace steady, always watching the terrain ahead. The rock formations loomed larger as they approached, jagged and ancient, their surfaces worn smooth by time. He scanned the base of the cliffs, looking for signs, any shift in the color of the sand, any break in the pattern of erosion. Then he saw it, a narrow crevice at the base of one of the largest rock structures, where the sand was darker, denser. He moved toward it, dropping to one knee and pressing his fingers against the ground. It was damp. Not much, but enough. He stood and turned to the others. "Here," the blue-skinned cadet frowned. "Here, what?" George grabbed a small digging tool from his pack and drove it into the sand. The others watched as he worked, their skepticism clear, but after several minutes of effort, the sand gave way to compacted earth. And then, just a few inches deeper, a thin trickle of moisture seeped up. The reptilian cadet took a sharp breath. "That's groundwater," George confirmed. Excitement flickered through the group, but George knew better than to celebrate yet. A trickle wouldn't be enough. They needed a way to collect and purify it, to make it last. He glanced at the rock formations overhead. If he could redirect condensation, create a proper filtration system. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "We dig, we build, we make this work." And so, under the relentless sun, they got to work. The digging was slow, grueling work under the relentless sun. The sand gave way to hardened earth, and soon moisture clung to George's hands as he worked. His muscles ached, his skin burned, but he didn't stop. Neither did the others. The reptilian cadet, despite his earlier skepticism, dug with renewed determination, his sharp claws making deep gouges in the compacted soil. The blue-skinned cadet, her body slick with sweat, used a makeshift scoop to remove loose dirt, her breathing steady but labored. George pressed his fingers into the deepening hole, feeling the coolness beneath the surface. It wasn't just a shallow patch of damp earth. There was something below. Something that could sustain them if they could reach it. He wiped the sweat from his brow and motioned for the others to keep going. Hours passed. The sun inched toward its peak, its rays relentless. Some cadets faltered, forced to take brief moments of rest in the narrow shade provided by the rock formations. George allowed them their breaks, but only for moments at a time. Stopping for too long would only make it harder to start again. Then, as his blade struck the ground once more, a sudden shift in the soil sent a ripple through the pit. A few more strokes, and a thin, darkened stream seeped up from below, slowly pooling at the bottom. The reptilian cadet inhaled sharply, his black eyes widening. The blue-skinned cadet's mouth parted, her hands frozen mid-motion. George remained still for a second, then reached down, scooping a small handful of water and letting it trickle through his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The others rushed forward, some dropping to their knees to see for themselves, others whispering in hushed disbelief. The reptilian cadet exhaled in a mixture of relief and awe. "It's real." George stood, rubbing the excess moisture from his palm. "It's not just real," he said. "It's ours now." The blue-skinned cadet blinked up at him. "How do we make sure it lasts?" George glanced around at the rock formations, considering. They couldn't just drink straight from the ground. The water was mixed with sediment, and without proper filtration it could make them sick. But they had supplies. Between their ration kits, their gear, and the environment around them, there was enough to build something sustainable. He motioned for the others to start gathering materials. They stripped fabric from their packs, carved out thin channels in the dirt to redirect the water, and assembled crude filtration layers, using fine sand and heated rocks to purify each drop they collected. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. Hours passed, and as the sun began its slow descent, the first drinkable portions were collected. The cadets passed the water carefully between them, each taking small sips, their bodies desperate for hydration. No one spoke much as they drank. There was no need. George sat back, watching them, watching how the cadets who had once doubted him now followed his lead without hesitation. It wasn't about authority. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. They had learned, adapted, and endured. As night fell, the temperature dropped, but this time the cold no longer seemed as threatening. They had shelter. They had water. They had each other. George exhaled, letting himself feel the weight of what they had done. He hadn't just survived. He had taught them how to survive. The test was over, but the lesson would stay with them forever.